Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Amanda Sutton, the Events and Marketing Director for Bookworks, your 36-year-old independent bookstore in the North Valley of Albuquerque. Thank you so much for joining us. We're very pleased to have local author Eric Lahti with us today. We're going to be launching his new novel, Roadside Attractions. We're very pleased to be representing a local author once again. Please do remember to support your independent bookstores during this time. Bookworks is doing curbside service right now. We haven't quite opened back up to the public yet, but we have curbside service Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday from 10 to 2, and then Wednesday from 2 to 6. So you can always order online. Our website is Bookworks without the O's. So that's BKWRKS.com. I'll put a link for Eric's book into the chat. And if you have any questions while we're talking and reading, be sure to put your question in there. We can ask Eric at the end. Eric Lahti grew up in New Mexico, where he developed a fascination for the metaphysical, looking for UFOs and buried treasure. Eric works out at Kirtland Air Force Base, and when he's not working, he might be blogging, working on his computer, or writing. He's author of the ongoing Henchmen series, which includes Henchmen, Arise, and Transmute, as well as a collection of action horror novellas about a man and his talking gun. He has a collection of interlocking stories called The Clock Man, and this new book, Roadside Attractions, does some ghost hunting in the scariest place of all, Arizona. So Eric, would you like to tell us a little bit more about your novel?
Certainly. It's one of those things that just kind of popped up out of nowhere. I don't know if anybody has ever been south between Tucson and Las Cruces, but for about 200 miles in every direction, there are signs everywhere saying, "What is the thing?" And it's just this roadside attraction that was put up sometime in the 50s by apparently a guy who had worked in Hollywood, designing models and characters and stuff like that. And then he decided, well, let's go ahead and make a mummy and then see how many people we can fake out. And the whole thing got purchased by some company. I want to say it was Boland's or something like that. And they put up billboards every which way. Well, I've driven by the place several times and never actually managed to stop. Because every time I was going out there, people said, no, let's just keep right on going. But anyway, I looked it up online and it seemed like it would be a good place for a story. And, the idea always enters your head, like, what if it is real? And then everything sort of coalesced together when I was driving home to pick up my son and I was listening to Iron Maiden's Number of the Beast. And I thought, okay, there's the link up. So you put the two of them together and suddenly you've got a fresh place for a story. Kind of out in the middle of nowhere, something that probably a lot of people are aware of, but very few people have actually stopped. And so if you ever get a chance and you're down on, I think it's I-10 that goes down that direction, you could probably take a look at it. From what I've heard, it's interesting. But there you go. That's how the whole thing kind of came together. It's one of those few stories that I've written that just happened. And there wasn't a whole lot of planning. It just sort of flowed out naturally. So once I got the two pieces put in place, everything was hunky-dory. So it's also one of the few I've written that is in third person. Most of them have been in first person, but I've started kind of going back and forth between the two of them. So it's a little bit horror, it's a little bit action, it's snarky at points, and the early reviews have been pretty good. Some people say I curse a little bit too much, but you can always just ignore those parts and keep right on moving. But personally, I think it's a fun read, and I'm a little biased about that, but it's always been one of my favorite stories that I've done. And I've actually written 2 books beyond this that haven't been released yet, but this one is still one that I kind of come back to and look at as almost a lighthearted, fun story with a lot of fairly dark elements to it.
Nice. Well, I have to admit, I've seen the signs, but I've never stopped. So now I'm super intrigued.
They do have a website that has some good pictures on it. So, I mean, that may be just as good as anything else, unless you feel like driving all the way down there and then driving out to the middle of nowhere in Dragoon, Arizona.
Tell us a little bit more about your favorite genres. What genres could we expect to see in your writing?
Traditionally, I've really liked science fiction, which is odd because I've never actually written a sci-fi book. Kind of plotting one out in my head right now, but I haven't gotten around to starting it. So a lot of them sort of fall into the urban fantasy or magical realism idea of, hey, here's this real thing that's happened, but let's go ahead and throw in the ghost of a jackalope and see what happens. And so it allows me to kind of take a look at it from what if, almost like, you know, if you're ever at a grocery store and you think, I wonder what's behind this place. You go look behind and, you know, you never find the ghost of a jackalope, but it's a little bit different way of looking at things. So urban fantasy is fun. Magical realism are fun because they allow you to take the real world and add something to it. Or say, you know, just what if this kind of thing happened? Like, for instance, with the thing, what if it was real and not just some prop that somebody had put together?
Tell us a little bit about how growing up in New Mexico and your childhood might have shaped some of these adventures that you go on in your writing.
I grew up in Farmington, New Mexico, which is, at the best of times, kind of a weird little place. And I also grew up right in, or I should say, started coming of age. I was in my high school years and early college years when the Satanic Panic hit. And so everybody in town just lost it. And they were absolutely convinced that Satanists were out in the hills and they were getting ready to plot the overthrow of the United States and all this other stuff. So growing up in the middle of that, of course, growing up in the middle of the Cold War when we were absolutely certain that the Russians were going to nuke us at any given time, you kind of start to take a different view of things. It's like, well, everything could come to an end, but, you know, the Cars just released a new album, so let's go listen to that instead. And so I grew up skateboarding out there, and I grew up mountain biking out there, and there wasn't a whole lot to do in Farmington, so you had to be fairly creative. And I think that's probably where some of it comes from, but you can't discount the idea that it was a little bit of a weird world at the time. And so some of that really did stick into place. And like, I'm not joking, we actually did go out in the hills and look for UFOs, and we knew a guy that was a treasure hunter, and we went out looking for buried treasure. So it was a fun life. And, you know, this is obviously before video game consoles and the internet and Zoom meetings and everything else. So we had to kind of find our fun stuff wherever we could.
Any luck with the buried treasure or the ghost hunting? Do you have any stories or close calls?
Unfortunately not with the treasure hunting, which that would have probably been a life-changing thing. But one of the guys that my mom knew had actually done a whole lot of research, and he'd been searching for this buried treasure that was out northeast of Farmington, out in the Badlands, for years, and nobody ever found it. But we poked around out there, and it's kind of an interesting world because we found big chunks of rocks, and it's all sandstone up there. So when they call it Badlands, they're not really joking. It's pretty broken terrain. But there was a section that was just this natural occurrence, and you could see where somebody had drilled in holes, and he made himself a nice big tent out of all of this sandstone, and supposedly had buried like 9 tons of gold out there someplace. So it was probably all nonsense, but it was kind of fun poking around out there. And it was also kind of fun seeing, like, dude, somebody did live out here. And I mean, this place is like 50 miles from anywhere. So he had to have some just amazing sights at night, because I'm sure the stars were unbelievably cool. And, you know, same kind of thing with the UFOs. We never really found anything, but it was fun to go out and look and read up on it and see if we could figure anything out.
How do you fit your writing into your full-time job? What's your routine there?
I work 6:30 to 3:30. And that was just because I needed to be able to go pick up my son after school, and it's kind of stuck. So it gives me quite a bit of time in the afternoons and evenings to write. And usually I won't start even writing until sometimes 9 or 10 o'clock, and work for maybe an hour, hour and a half sometimes, and then call it done. And if I can keep doing that every day, I can usually write a book in about a year, which is not terribly fast, but certainly not as slow as it could be.
How long did you say?
About a year.
Oh, okay. That's
so start to finish and edited and kind of ready to go. This one I'm working on right now, though, has fought me tooth and nail. And so I've been working on it since probably last August. And it's one of those that I'll hit a point and it's like, I can't do this anymore. And then go off and write some short stories and submit those, and then wait 6 months for no one to respond. So that one's taken a little bit longer, but it's almost ready for beta readers.
All right. Well, tell us a little bit about Roadside Attractions. Who's the main character?
There are actually multiple main characters, but the primary roadside attraction is the ghost of a young woman named Janine. And she gets killed, I think, in the first 3 pages of the story. So she spends the whole time trying to figure out, who am I as a ghost, and how does that reconcile with the fact that, she was basically picked up by the side of the road and sacrificed, and all of the adventures that happen from there. And so she moves from basically being a drug addict who was sacrificed by a bunch of would-be Satanists who thought that they were going to get something out of it, to having to reconcile herself to this magical new world that she inhabits. And among other things, she does meet the ghost of the last jackalope, who kind of helps her navigate things. And then you've got a pair of witch hunter or ghost hunters. One's a scientist and one's a witch, who get dragged into the whole thing. And then a renegade devil who's trying to kick off Armageddon, and then the hit woman sent from hell to stop him. And so they all kind of coalesce around this little spot in Dragoon, Arizona, trying to figure out who's going to raise the thing and who's going to stop the thing from being raised.
All right. Do you have a passage that you want to read us to kind of illustrate some of the writing?
I've got a couple of them in here. We'll do bits and pieces, if that's okay.
Sounds good to me.
If I start going too long, just throw something at me or cut the mic.
All right.
All right. So the first one is Janine first figuring out who she is. And it comes about 9 chapters into the book. And it's where she's trying to reconcile herself to the fact that she's a ghost and trying to figure out how she can interact with people, because she's still very opinionated about things. The museum was dark and deathly silent at night. If she weren't already a ghost, Janine would have been worried the place was haunted. During the day, the jackalopes looked like stuffed novelties, poorly sewn trinkets that tourists bought, adored for a few minutes, and tossed in the trash. At night, the half-jackalope, half-jackrabbit, half-antelope creatures looked like chimeras from a post-apocalyptic wonderland. Being a ghost was a different experience. All her life, Janine had people telling her how amazing she looked and asking if they could do things for her. In death, she could only make herself out in the vague kind of way as a glowing bluish woman who looked basically like she used to look. Her hair was better behaved, but other than the hair and the glow, Janine still thought she looked like herself. Of course, no one else could see her. During the day, while Jimmy was touching himself and flipping through the porn magazines on the rack behind the counter, Janine wandered the museum and the store. She flipped off people. She yelled in their ears. She exposed herself to them, removing her top to flash them with her glowing breasts. Nothing. Nada. Zip. Zilch. Zero. Until something strange happened. Just before the store closed, the meanest, ugliest woman in the world came in, towing a pair of filthy kids. The woman yanked them both, one in each hand, into the store, then ushered them into the bathroom. She made her way to the cashier and screamed bloody murder at Jimmy about the price of gas, raising 2 kids, how there were still liberals in the world, and why won't those truckers just slow down? It had to be all the drugs they took. As one of the kids walked past, Janine noticed he was holding his arm. When he turned around, she caught a glimpse of bruises on his shoulder. While she didn't have conclusive proof that the woman was into smacking her kids around, Janine didn't require proof. She was a ghost. It was like the until death do you part of getting married. She and life had parted ways, but were still on speaking terms. As a dead person, she didn't feel the laws that govern the living still applied to her. The fact still remained. Janine was a ghost, and there wasn't a jail in the world that could hold a ghost, which meant that she could get away with an awful lot, especially since she didn't have to worry about going to hell when she died, unless the museum was hell. In either case, the problem was solved. Janine followed the woman into the bathroom and waited until she sat down in a stall. When the woman was fully situated and feeling safe, Janine reared back and exploded forward with a kick that would have made her third-grade karate instructor proud. Her ethereal foot shot straight and powerful in a perfectly executed kick that went right through the door without touching the thing. Ah, Janine yelled. I can't even kick this chick's ass. Janine sat on the floor, feeling sorry for herself and hoping she'd catch some disease that would kill her off once and for all. She didn't even move as the lady opened the stall door. What made Janine sit up and take notice was when the lady passed through her, she felt a shock. For the briefest of moments, she was one with the lady. All the woman's dreams, desires, and abuses flooded into Janine's head. But something else happened too. Janine felt an electric charge as the woman passed through. The charge dissipated quickly, but it was definitely there. Janine rose and spun in the air. She could see herself reflected in the mirror floating in the background. The woman was focused on washing her hands as if she could wash off the sins of her life and the misery she'd wrought with mere hand soap and tepid water. Janine's mind kept flashing back to the images of the woman's past. A doting father, a husband that loved her, all the trappings of a wonderful life. But something had short-circuited. She'd been given everything she wanted by the people in her life. They called her things like beautiful, wonderful, and amazing. And all the while, the praise fed a monster. Her ego swelled to the point that she couldn't understand why, as her looks faded, she didn't get what she wanted and lashed out at everyone around her. Janine's ghostly form dimmed. If she hadn't died on that rock, if she'd stayed on her trajectory, she would have been this woman in about 20 years. After her looks faded and she found herself saddled with a life she didn't understand, it would have been her washing her hands in the bathroom sink while her kids tended to their bruises. No more. Janine got shocked out of her life with a knife buried in her chest. Since there were no knives to be found, not that she could hold one anyway, she'd have to find another way. When the woman passed through her, there was a hint of energy. Maybe she could replicate that. Janine stepped into the woman and was immediately flooded with power. Humans create so much energy. How had she missed that when she was alive? How had she missed out on the lifelong miracle of turning food into power for cells? The woman's mind was still a snake pit of confusion. Janine poked and prodded until she found what she wanted. There were hints, like tickles at the back of her mind, that she could do more than just poke around in people's heads. Maybe, with enough of a reason, she might even be able to push herself into their mind and take over. But that was for the future. Her ghostly form glowed brightly, even though she could feel some of her energy being siphoned off. She stepped back out of the maelstrom of memories in the woman's head and stood behind her. Janine's ghostly body shone like the moon. Finally, the woman finished washing her hands and looked up to examine the bags under her eyes. She examined her reflection in the mirror with hatred tinged with sadness until something caught her eye. Janine smiled and waved. And from there, let's move on to a different one.
Janine sounds pretty ornery.
What's that?
Janine sounds pretty ornery.
She's definitely got her idea of how things are going to happen. And it turns out she's actually a fairly nice person, just stuck in a very bad situation. All right, the next one is a little bit about Char, who was the witch in the story. And she's actually the linchpin of the whole thing. And she's the reason that her and her friend get called down there, because the renegade devil is hoping to siphon off her power to reawaken the mummy that's inside of the Roadside Attraction. Though she would never admit it to Jordan, Char was never a Girl Scout. As a child, Char loved movies about ninjas. Her mother thought it was cute that her little girl wanted to watch movies about guys in black pajamas kicking and punching their way through life. There were worse things in the world, she reckoned, than a fascination with mystery. Years later, Charlotte had the opportunity to learn a bit of ninjutsu from a friend's boyfriend. It wasn't what she expected. Rather than magic and mystery, it was basically throwing people around. The kinds of things anyone could do if they set their mind to it. Years after that, Char finally learned that ninjas spent their lives training to be ninjas. Even as toddlers, they were introduced to tumbling and learning to walk balance beams. As they grew, so too did the training, until after decades, ninja kids became ninja adults. That was heartbreaking to Char. The fact that there was no magic involved made the ninja clans of yore seem less interesting, and her posters of Shokasuga and various ninja movie posters came down off the wall. Even though she never learned the fighting aspects of the ninja, the sneaking around part fascinated her. Char poured endless hours into experimenting into new and exciting ways of sneaking around. It became a game to her. She snuck through the halls of her high school and her college until sneaking became second nature, and she disappeared even from herself. After the sun went down and Dragoon rolled up the streets, she snuck out of the hotel room, out of the hotel, and down to the museum. Char knew in her heart that the ghost was the key to all of this. The statue with the staring eyes, the girl in the hoodie, the strange man in the suit, all of them were intertwined and orbiting that ghost. She couldn't explain how she knew, but Char was positive the ghost was the linchpin. But why the ghost was important was the question she hoped to answer. Unfortunately, that meant getting to the ghost girl. Also, unfortunately, that meant breaking into the museum. She wasn't much for picking locks, that was Jordan's forte, but she hoped to find an open window or an unlocked door. She stuck to the shadows as she crossed a small parking lot. Her eyes, narrowed in concentration, kept constant lookout for do-batters. The small town was dead at night. Occasional lights of long-haul truckers flashed along the interstate not far away, but the town itself was still as a grave. No one accosted her as she snuck quietly into the museum. Rather than going straight to the front door and looking in, Char took her time circling the dark building and looking for alternatives. Around back, she found what she was looking for. There was a single window in the middle of a wall. It wasn't big enough to crawl through, but it was clean enough to see through. With a quick check over her shoulders to make sure she was alone, she peered in. The museum was dark, but like all buildings, it had a faint night lighting to help thieves steal things more easily. There was something about looking into the building that night that made Char feel dirty, like she was watching the museum slipping out of its undies and getting ready for a bath. Other than a ticking clock on the wall and the low rumble of the air conditioner, the place was quiet. Just as she was getting ready to find another place to look in, a hint of movement caught her eye. Somewhere in the darkness, something had moved. Char's heart stopped. Whatever it was moving around in there. It probably meant trouble. She pulled away from the window. The one night she decided to go peek in the window was the same night someone tried to rob the place. She pushed her face back up against the window just in time to see a stuffed jackalope float by. Whoever was carrying the jackalope was either masterfully camouflaged or a ghost. It could have been an elaborate setup of gears and pulleys designed to make it look like the jackalope was floating, but the ghost girl seemed a more logical choice. Char tapped on the window hoping to get the ghost's attention, but she didn't either hear it or was ignoring the noise. She pushed her nose up against the glass and tried to lean in the direction the jackalope was going, but there was no way to see what was going on. Carrying a stuffed jackalope was strange behavior even for a ghost. They weren't always the most rational beings to begin with. Jordan always assumed it had something to do with being stuck in a place that made so many ghosts go mental. When ghosts weren't actively wreaking havoc, they tended to repeat tasks over and over or wander aimlessly. Carrying a stuffed jackalope seemed like intentional behavior. She had to find a way to see more. The front of the building was all windows, but it would expose her to anyone driving by. Of course, the town was dead to the world, so it was unlikely anybody would be driving by. Char took a deep breath and moved back to the front. If she got caught, she could always claim she was a tourist, or use some magic to put the zap on someone's head. Through the front window, she got a better view, but the museum part seemed to be in the building where there were no windows. After all, it wouldn't do to have people being able to see the mysteries of the Terror's Museum without coughing up some cash. Whatever was happening was related to the museum itself. Char stopped herself. There was no way this little roadside attraction actually held something important enough to attract that kind of attention. There had to be something she wasn't aware of, something beyond the man, the girl, the statue, and the ghost. But what? She quietly disappeared into the shadows and made her way around back. Her cell reception was crap in this town, but it was good enough to call up the wiki on the Terror. According to the internet, this was just some place put together to pull in tourists. The primary draw of the museum was the Terror itself, a mummy of a woman holding an infant. And the general consensus was that it had been made by a semi-famous Hollywood prop guy as a joke. The wiki page was lacking in details, but there were pictures. As she scrolled through them, Char wondered just what the hell was going on. Hitler's staff car, who cares? Strange lithographs of devils cavorting with women? Tacky porn at best. Then she found the picture of the Terror itself. She almost laughed to herself at how fake it looked. There was no way this was real. This whole place was nothing more than a tourist trap with cold beverages and reasonably clean bathrooms. She was about to turn off her phone and go back to the hotel when something odd caught her eye. The image of the Terror wasn't super detailed, but around the mummy's neck was a shape that looked familiar. It was small with harsh edges that almost looked too razor-sharp to be organic. If she were to guess, Char would have said it looked like a ring. When she expanded the picture, she mostly got a mass of pixels, but in that blocky milieu was the faintest hint of red and massive tans. Ring, red. Something echoed in Char's mind, but she couldn't put a finger on it. The realization nearly buckled her knees. Char frantically scrabbled in her pockets. It had to be here somewhere, but where was it? On the second pass through her pockets, cursing under her breath all the way jeans manufacturers made pants on women's pockets, she found it lurking in that strange, tiny pocket that all jeans have. The ruby on Mrs. Owen's ring looked discolored in the sodium arc light, but the shape was unmistakable. Char held the ring up to the blown-up picture on her phone. The same odd, three-pointed gem was in her hand and around the baby's neck. It couldn't have been a coincidence. It had to be a coincidence, but there was no way the gems were related. Aside from the fact that she'd never come across a three-pointed gem anywhere ever before, there was nothing to link the ghost holder gem in her hand to the necklace around the Terror's throat. But they couldn't be related. The gem in her hand held ghosts in place by cutting off their way out. That kind of magic wouldn't work to keep a living thing in place. It would require far too much power. Or would it? What was it Jordan had asked about the ghost holding the ghost in place? How much power would it take? A lot, Char answered, on the order of several sacrifices a month at least. Far too much to not go unnoticed in this day and age. The statistics alone would have brought every cop in the world down on dragoon. And no one in their right mind would expend that much energy to keep a ghost in a convenience store. But what if the spell was for something other than a ghost and it just caught the ghost girl up in its web? That would mean there was a different source of power out there somewhere. Something with the energy to keep up a spell that held a physical person in a flesh and blood jail cell. Anyway, she sliced it up in her head. That was a tremendous amount of power. In addition to a lot of blood spilled or some seriously whacked out sex magic, That was the kind of power that was needed to keep a truly magical being, or only a truly magical being could produce. Char was so focused on her phone and her thoughts that she barely registered the crunch of gravel under her boots. She looked up just in time to see a blur before her head snapped back with a loud crack. Her sinuses erupted in a dazzling display of pain and her eyes filled with water. Each breath was a struggle. She was only barely conscious of falling to her knees. Distantly, she heard someone crying out in pain. "Brides of Lucifer, my ass," the voice said. Through her ringing ears, his voice sounded distant and indistinct, but smooth as silk across bare flesh. "Your lot was never good enough for him." Char wiped her eyes and sucked in a breath. Through the fisheye lens of tears and swelling, she saw a pair of black shoes. Her eyes tracked slowly upward, following neatly pressed slacks to a blood-red shirt and a black jacket. He even had a tie on. His face was angular, distorted in some misplaced anger. "I'm not a threat to you," she whimpered. "No," he said, "you're not. You're nothing. You have all the power in the universe and you don't even know how to use it." Something pinged in Char's mind. This wasn't the first time someone had attacked her for being a witch, but they usually didn't understand what being a witch entailed. Most people had shoved crucifixes in her face and asked if they burned her flesh or slapped her around with Bibles. Those poor misguided souls had never imagined what being a witch really meant. They only knew that their book told them to kill witches. This person seemed to understand what he was dealing with, and that was very bad news. He grabbed a fistful of hair and dragged Char to her feet. "Please," she whimpered, "no more, I'll go." For her troubles, he punched her in the side of the head. Her ears rang as the blood rushed to flow the new damage. The edges of her vision darkened and the world went catawampus. She felt bile rise up from her stomach and knew she probably had a concussion. "Bitch," he hissed in her face. Heavens above, but he had beautiful ice blue eyes. "The only place you're going to is the grave." I'll go ahead and break it there. He winds up throwing her into the shop.
Ooh, yikes. Okay, so there's a lot happening here. This town is called Dragoon, Arizona. It has a terror museum and it has all these wily characters showing up. Can you tell us a little bit more about the setting?
Dragoon actually is a real place. It's a small town out in the middle of nowhere. If you're going along I-10 down in southern Arizona, if you blink, you'll miss it. But you will notice the signs pointing to the thing. So those will point you right at it. Dragoon itself is actually, I think, just pretty much that little roadside attraction, although it does have a population of like 200, at least according to Google. So go figure, somebody's living out there.
All right.
So, that's the real world town. And in the course of the story, or in the world of the story, it's still pretty much that. It's just that that's where the guy who just beat up Char landed after he got kicked out of hell. And so he's trying to kickstart an apocalypse, and he's the one that called her and Jordan down in there, and he's the one that lured the ghost into place, and he's really the orchestrator of the whole thing. But he's trying to focus power into the thing so that he can wake it back up.
Ah, okay. All right, so we've heard from Janine and Char, two female characters. How was that for you, getting into the head and to the perspective of these female characters?
You know, it's interesting. I didn't really sit down and think that I was going to write a book with that many female characters, but I would argue that all of the primary characters in the book are women. The other character that we haven't heard from, Lilith, is the hit woman that gets sent to stop the stranger. And so you've got all three of these guys, or all three of these women who are kind of orbiting, and they can't really figure out how everything fits together, or even if they're on the same side, but they really are. It's just because nobody knows the whole story. And so trying to get into their heads, I don't know, I just kind of hope for the best, actually.
All right, you mentioned before that you'd written mainly in first person and that this one is more of an omniscient viewpoint.
Mm-hmm.
Did this sort of happen naturally, or is that something that you set out to do purposefully?
I figured that the story was going to be complicated enough that trying to write it in first person wouldn't work. And that's actually one of the struggles I'm coming into with the Henchman series. Is the first three were all first person. And the story is getting convoluted enough that I'm not entirely certain how I'm going to pull off the fourth and final book in first person, but I definitely don't want to change it at this point because that would be kind of jarring and it would move it out of what it is now. So this was actually the second book I'd written in third person omniscient. The first was Greetings from Sunny and Luna, which is a story about martial arts and dragons and drugs in a fictional world. And so that's the closest to arguably true fantasy that I've written.
Very cool.
I think 3 people read that one.
Does anybody else have any questions for Eric? If you do come up with something, feel free to either type it in the chat, or I can always turn on your sound if you'd like to address him directly. Is there anything else you'd like to read or tell us about? Mr. Eric?
Oh, sorry, I was pulling up the chat there.
All right, Rowena says, great reading, Eric. All right, do you want to...
That Rowena actually joined. Cool. So what kind of questions does anybody else have for you? And I can read some more if you want to.
Sure, do you have another character that you'd like to introduce us to?
Let's see if we can find Lilith. I'm trying to remember exactly where she first shows up. No, even better. Let's take a look at the stranger. So this is the guy that just beat up Shaw. And he never gets a name. In fact, throughout the story, you find that as he was kicked out of hell, Lucifer took his name. So he doesn't even really know who he is. Just kicked out and thrown onto earth, and it's like, leave us the hell alone. And so over the space of hundreds of years, he tries to get back to where he came from. The stranger walked down the empty streets of Dragoon, whistling Leonard Cohen's Tower of Song to himself. There was a spring in his step that he hadn't felt in a couple hundred years, and the maudlin tune about old age and slow death brought a smile to his face. Tonight, he'd taken the first steps in bringing the full might of his revenge to bear. By nightfall, most of Dragoon was either fast asleep or dreaming of escape or partying down in the desert surrounded by scrub brush and chanting strange poems to uncaring powers. The stranger hated chanting, and he knew for a fact that the person those idiots were chanting to hated it too. That was one thing they still had in common, even if most everything else in their friendship had fallen apart. It felt like smashing something, or maybe burying an axe in someone's skull. But he knew he still had to have patience. There was no real reason to hurry. After 2 centuries of plotting and waiting for just the right person, a few more days wouldn't make much difference. Hopefully, the 2 Nimrod ghost hunters would be here tomorrow. He toyed with the idea of offering them a job going after Janine, but using a bit of magic to control their phones was more fun. It was just sheer dumb luck that they stumbled into a former pupil of his and survived to tell the tale. It would take Janine a bit of time to figure out how to get her side going, but for all her nitwittery, she wasn't a complete waste. In another time, another life perhaps, she could have been an amazing person. It was almost a pity, though, that her life came crashing to a halt before she could sort herself out. At least her death solved a pair of problems for him. At any rate, time was on his side. By keeping things quiet and low-key, he kept Lucifer in the dark. The houses all looked the same in late dusk. There were little things made of wood and plaster, not at all the towering spires of his home. These people, he mused to himself for the umpteenth time, have no sense of style. He turned a corner and spied his destination. The lights were off, but Sebastian's Jeep was parked out front, so the fool was either sleeping or jerking off. The stranger stopped in the middle of the street and lit up a cigarette. As the smoke wafted lazily into the air, he empathized with it. Without wind, the smoke was stuck in one place. He didn't have to worry about wind so much as he had to worry about an anchor. But that anchor, and the prohibited access to it, was about to disappear. The stranger stubbed his cigarette out on one of the Jeep's seats and left the smoldering remains to burn through the pleather. He stopped at the end of the driveway and listened. No sounds, not even a thump of a pathetic human pleasuring himself. Sleeping then, probably drunk and high and feeling safe in his box-like house. His foot didn't pause when he smashed into the door. The frame exploded in a shower of broken shards, and the door vaulted across the room. It smashed into the TV and embedded itself in the screen. The TV's death squeal, a pitiable squeak that ended in sparks, made him chuckle under his breath. The stranger couldn't have executed it better if he'd planned. In the back of the house, the place where the odious Sebastian held court with the women in his magazine, someone was stumbling around. There was a loud crash and a thumping noise as the oaf first broke a lamp, then dropped his baseball bat. The man was apparently fast asleep, maybe napping before hitting hill parties tonight. The stranger leaned casually against the shelf full of books by supposed occult authors who'd likely never seen magic happen in real life. If he'd still had his name, he could have shown them all manner of amazing magics, things that went beyond planting thoughts in a would-be sorcerer's heads or sending magic messages to phones. His true power could titillate, delight, and castrate. The cheap mass-produced books could never have touched what he knew. The magic contained in a spell or a chant wasn't something that could be replicated on a printing press. It had to be written in blood and souls. It had to be committed to memory and become part of the sorcerer. The books purported to impart knowledge and power to the reader, but the authors forgot that it is impossible to mass-produce power, and true knowledge must be hard-won. As it was, his resources were dwindling. Without a name, magic wouldn't come to him, so he'd had to rip it out of the ground until he found enough. Not that it would matter soon. He still had enough power left for a pair of magnificent displays that had been a long time coming. Sebastian stumbled out of the room, bat held in front of him like he was hoping to poke whatever got in his way. "Who's there?" he yelled. "I'm a powerful wizard and I've got a baseball bat. You don't want any part of me." "Pathetic. Tisk, tisk, Sebastian," the stranger said. "I would hardly call you a wizard, let alone a powerful one, and it's obvious you've never played baseball in your life." Sebastian peered into the shadows. "You kick in my door and broke your television with your door." A sneer spread across Sebastian's face. "Are you trying to get me to punish her? You people only think you can die, but I assure you it's possible." It was time to show the boy who he was really dealing with. "Sebastian, what do you know about me?" the stranger asked. "I know you're stuck here because you're in love with that mummy, and I know I can hurt her. I also know I'm the only thing keeping her alive, so if you kill me, your girlfriend's toast. She can spend eternity in that rotted out shell of a brain and do whatever it is you fuckers do when you die. So why don't you scoot along and find someone to fix my door?" Sebastian leaned the bat against the wall and turned to go back to bed. "Don't mess with me, I'll do it. All I have to do is stop feeding her energy and she gets decades of agony, or worse." "Go ahead and do it then," the stranger said. Sebastian stalked across the room like a bull, picked up his baseball bat and shoved it in the stranger's face. "Do not fuck with me. Now get the fuck out." Sebastian eased his head around the bat and stared into Sebastian's bloodshot eyes. "You didn't answer my question, Sebastian. Do you know who I am?" "Some lightweight lowlife that got kicked out of hell for screwing the king's daughter or something. Look, I don't know how you freaks do your thing down there, and I don't care. All I know is I've got twins lined up for an evening in my bed, and I need my rest. So if you kindly fuck off, I don't have to bash your skull in and hurt your girl." "Lowlife? Hardly." The stranger chuckled, and it was his daughter and her best friend. The stranger's fist was a blur. The fist that had dropped devils twice his size smashed into Sebastian's jaw and snapped his neck backwards. Sebastian teetered back and forth before falling over in a heap. The stranger knelt and checked for a pulse. "Lightweight?" he asked. "I'm not the one who fainted after a light tap on the jaw. You are an insult to your lineage. I once punched your great-great-grandfather. He at least had the common decency to punch me back." He slapped Sebastian a few times before picking him up and depositing his unconscious form on a tattered recliner. Most knockouts only last a few minutes at the most. Any longer, and there'd be a risk of serious brain injury. Not that Sebastian was going to have to worry about that for much longer. Sebastian's eyes slowly opened, but he couldn't tell where he was or what had happened. He shook his head and looked around, finally settling on the stranger sitting on his couch and glaring at him. "I thought I told you," he slurred. "I asked you the question, Sebastian, about who I am. Would you like to try again, or would you rather get knocked out again? I hear the damage to the brain can be quite severe. You might not even be able to do that thing you generously call magic." The air crackled and popped around them. Strange dark energies swirled around the room, knocking over pictures and unsettling a pile of dishes on the coffee table. With eyes full of power and hatred, Sebastian said, "No, I don't care who you are. You're nothing." A blast of power arced from the ceiling and down along the floor before ripping through the sofa. The stranger dodged the stray bits and pieces that rolled across the floor. Eyes filled with deep ebon focused on Sebastian. A blast of power tinged with orange and the acrid smell of sulfur slammed into Sebastian's chest. Wounds opened up on his arms, weeping blood. Even though it tapped into his dangerously low energy reserves, slicing up the human felt good. "Wrong move, Sebastian," the stranger said. "You're out of your league. Your grandfather was a powerful wizard, but that genetic link seems to be tenuous at best." Sebastian's eyes rolled back into his head as he spread his bleeding arms wide. He spoke the Lord's Prayer back, mumbled in Latin. It was typical of Sebastian. He tended to go straight for the most powerful thing he could think of without wondering who wrote the spell in the first place. The air in the room grew heavy, oppressive with expectant power. Wind that came from nowhere and everywhere swirled, stroking like a lover's fingers at first, but soon turned into the angry fist of a drunken partner. The stranger recognized the game Sebastian was playing. It was entirely possible he created the game himself over the centuries. "Tisk, tisk, Sebastian," he said, "calling on help? That's cheating, but I must admit I like it." As the power in the room was about to reach an orgasmic crescendo, the stranger pulled a small dagger from his back and jammed it into Sebastian's stomach. The energy in the air dissipated. Papers floated lazily down to new homes. Sebastian lurched forward and into the stranger's outstretched arms. He clung to the man's suit, suddenly afraid that he'd damned himself for all eternity. A tear rolled down his cheek. Don't fret, Sebastian, the stranger whispered in his ear. Damnation is not coming for you. You'd have had an eternity of pleasure for your services if I were to let you die, but I can't have that, not after what you and your family have done to mine. Sebastian tried to pull away, but found his feet wouldn't move. Through pain-filled eyes, he looked down and found his feet had turned to alabaster white. What have you done? He whispered to the stranger. I'm merely making a memorial to your service, the stranger replied. Wait, that's not entirely correct. I'm making you into a memorial for your service. Cheer up, Sebastian. I've just given you eternal life. He pushed himself away from Sebastian and grinned as horror spread over the man's face. His legs had turned to stone and white tendrils were working up his torso. As his body slowly turned to cold rock, Sebastian wailed. His tongue lashed out at all the people that wronged him, mother, father, grandmother, God, Lucifer. No, Sebastian, the stranger said, hurt myself. Sebastian's arms reached out to the stranger, half placating, half hoping to grab him and choke the life out of him as a final act of defiance, but it was no use. The stranger merely stepped back and smiled. As long as that statue survives, you will live forever. His arms turned to stone, fingers forever grasping for something, anything that would save him from the hell he'd created for himself. He screamed in terror, a keening wail that shrieked to the heavens and desperate for anyone to help him. The tendrils worked their way up his mouth until his face solidified, forever screaming in horror. The stone worked its way across his head, leaving only Sebastian's eyes, ears, and fingers untouched. The stranger looked on his creation and clapped his hands slowly. You've never looked better, Sebastian, he said. You finally have the rock-hard body you've always wanted. Terrified eyes watched the stranger as he paced aimlessly around the room, examining books and posters. As he wandered, the stranger talked to what was left of Sebastian. I know you think we're incapable of love, but that's not true. I loved her deeply, more than I've ever loved anyone or anything. And that love was taken from me because her father didn't approve, and your family colluded with him to take her from me. Sebastian's panicked eyes followed the stranger around the room, silently pleading for mercy as the man in the suit randomly destroyed things. Legend had it the people who worshipped the Dark Lord were determined to an eternity of darkness, but his family knew better. They'd been promised a special place in hell for their service. Being transformed into a living statue had never entered the equation. The stranger examined the big bookcase in the corner and chuckled to himself. Did you know most of these books were written by hack authors out to make a quick buck? There's no power at all in any of them. You can't mass produce power, you have to earn it. Back home, I had grimoires written by some of the finest magical and alchemical minds in 2 planes. You have a copy of the Necronomicon. You do realize this was made up, right? Lovecraft created in that delightful mind of his. All this crap, just like your whole life, my old friend. You glommed onto power and wrote it. I knew your great-great-great-grandfather. Did you know that? That man understood power. His spell, powered by a gift from Lucifer himself, was what kept me here all these years. It was supposed to be permanent. Your family would provide the spellcaster and keep everything safe and sane, and hell would reward you with knowledge. And you screwed it all up, Sebastian. No riches, no rewards, no power, no knowledge. You'll spend eternity as a statue. I'm going to leave your eyes open so you can watch your world fall apart. I thought about leaving your ears, but I really hate you and I want you to be as miserable as possible. So the only thing you get to hear from now on is your own desperate screaming in your head forever.